Good afternoon. This is Michael Carano with RBP Chemical Technology and chair of the IPC's Thought Leadership Program. I want to welcome you to this next interview. We're going to be talking to Bryan Erwin, who has a very impressive resume. He's going to talk about various things related to trade and trade policy, among other things. Prior to doing that, for those of you who are not familiar with the IPC Thought Leadership Program, IPC created this group this last year because we are looking as IPC to build a leadership in the global electronics industry on topics and issues that drive change for this industry. And as an association, meaning IPC, that represents thousands of companies in the electronics industry supply chain, we need to astutely be aware of all these drivers and how they are all connected. And we must have a strategic vision going forward on how to use the awareness to lead change and promote proactive management of these drivers, as well as growth and prosperity for this industry. Now, to achieve this goal, IPC has recruited and retained an august group of industry experts with knowledge and thought leadership in a variety of disciplines, including technology and innovation, workforce development, competition, marketing, economics, environmental health and safety, and of course, part of competing is understanding trade and trade policy. With me today is Bryan Erwin. Bryan is the founder and managing partner of Blue Wave Merchant Partners, and he was selected by President Obama in 2010 to run the Trade Advocacy Center, which is the nexus of senior official U.S. government advocacy on behalf of United States exporters. So while he was director, he advanced U.S. commercial interests by leading 177 successful campaigns, resulting in almost $200 billion in new business for the U.S. companies, supporting over 1 million jobs, which is very impressive. Bryan is going to talk a little bit about his additional background and also talk about the differences between trade policy and trade promotion, and how he can assist U.S. suppliers in their quest for global market penetration. So with that, I'd like to say hello to Bryan.
Hey, Mike, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Bryan, very impressive background. I see you had time in the White House. You spent some time also with Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle during his time. Bryan, there's a number of things obviously you're passionate about, and so tell me a little bit about what is really the one thing that you say you can say you really have passion about as to why you've joined this thought leadership group.
I think one thing I'm very passionate about, and this comes from my experience in the Obama administration, but even before that, working for Tom Daschle, and even my time in the private sector, is American competitiveness. And I don't mean that in a jingoistic way. I do mean it in a competitive way, right? I'm a competitive person. And obviously I like playing for the home team, and that was my jobs in the last few jobs I've had, and that's what we do here. But what makes me passionate about that is really leveling the playing field. If I can be a little bit more specific, it's not just cheerleading or home team for home team's sake or jingoism, really. It's really leveling the playing field. I do think a lot of American companies, exporters, play on an unlevel playing field. And some of that is because there are some scurrilous actors out there. Some of that is, we have a real live Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I'm glad we have to adhere to. But some of our other friends overseas don't have an FCPA, and so they have some undue influence. And some of that is because of the way our system is set up, and that's not a negative. There's a lot to speak of, that we have a very competitive system here in America. We don't have national champion companies that you and I can start our own competitor to Boeing, Mike, should you and I desire so. No one is going to stop us here in this country. Whereas I think in Europe, if we wanted to compete, if we were French and we wanted to compete against Airbus, I think a lot of the pan-European governments would say, well, hang on, we have a champion here that's being supported by the taxpayer. But that does create an unlevel playing field if you have national champion companies being supported by their home government. So my passion has been to kind of level that playing field as best as I can, either in public service or now in the private sector.
To that point, Brian, and that's very interesting. We've always talked about, and that's one of the things about IPC too over the years with its trade advocacy, government relations, and of course the reasons IPC was founded was based on standards, workmanship standards.
Mhm.
The idea of the standards was to level the playing field. So if all the people who are buying circuit boards and circuit board assemblies adhere to those workmanship standards, then that allows at least maybe some of the higher cost companies to be able to compete based on that workmanship standard. But there's still, we know that there's a lot of other unfair advantages that certain countries have with respect to their government subsidies, very low interest rates. Now, of course, they're low now, but before that, there was some near zero interest rates we had heard about from various companies, nationalization of various industries, support by governments that we don't necessarily do here. So how do you go about that? I mean, what you've worked with Tom Daschle, Senator Daschle, you were in the Obama administration. What kind of work did you need to do to create this awareness and say, look, you want us to be competitive, but here's why we're not, and what is the call to action from our lawmakers, who are the ones who can fix this, I guess.
Yeah, I have a little bit of good news here because as fractious as it seems like the last several years have been politically in our country, I'd argue that one of the last things that Republicans, Democrats, and everyone in between can agree on is export-led employment, right? It is mom and apple pie and Chevrolet as far as Congress is concerned, as far as the presidency is concerned, no matter who has been president. It makes a lot of sense. Each administration has been supportive of this. This goes back to the Trade Promotion Act, which was passed by a Democratic Congress, but signed by President George H.W. Bush in the late 80s, all the way through the establishment of the Advocacy Center in 93 by the Clinton administration, all the way through to some of the things that we undertook, and even the last administration, and now the current administration. So that's the good news. You will have the ear of a lawmaker. Obviously, if it affects jobs in the district, in the state, your local member of Congress, your local senator will pay a lot of attention to that. And obviously, whoever is in the White House, irrespective of their party, this is a key part of rebuilding America and rebuilding our employment base. So you will have some sympathetic ears as far as that goes. I also think the good news is that everyone has gotten the memo here. There was a time where there seemed, one caveat to what I'm arguing, there was an ideological divide on export-led financing. There was a certain cadre in Congress that led the charge against the Export-Import Bank. And I understand from an academic background, if you want to talk about market distorting financing, market distorting practices given by a country, that's very much something you can discuss in a salon or have an academic discussion. But I've talked to, and again, my old job in the Obama administration, I talked to companies and I assumed they were from across the political spectrum. I never asked, but I just will assume that they were pretty diverse in their political views. Every single one of them said, listen, we're getting our brains beaten in overseas, and I need the Export-Import Bank just to compete somewhat on a level playing field. I need my government to help us out here because our French friends, our English friends, our Chinese friends certainly are getting a lot of concessionary financing in this regard, and we need this help here. So, but that's gone away, which is great news. So I think you're going to have a lot of sympathetic ears. I also think, though, they need to hear more of that, right? Obviously, we're domestic consumer-led economy. 70% of GDP is the American domestic consumption, and kind of our export balance is a small part of that. But it is increasingly important overseas, and it's increasingly important to our current account deficit. It's increasingly important to our foreign exchange reserves. And so you're going to have a sympathetic ear, but you need to raise your voice. And it'll shock you on how many times a member of Congress may not know what is in his or her district and may not know that you are exporting overseas and how critical your company is to the employment base in that district. It will shock you on how sometimes a member of Congress who should know will not know. But I also will say that's the company's and that's the company's leadership's responsibility to make sure it is known within that district.
Okay. So with that said, let's say there's a group of us in Minneapolis, where I am, or where you are, and let's say there's 10 of us that make different kinds of widgets, and we all have less than 100 employees, but nonetheless, we employ 100 people, which is 1,000. how does what resources would be available, let's say, to those 10 small widget manufacturers to find a voice to even introduce them to potential partners overseas where they could export? Let's say they're not doing it now. Is there a Department of Commerce group that can help them, or et cetera?
Yeah, so let's bifurcate kind of what we were talking about before, that Capitol Hill lobbying, advocacy, White House advocacy, and let's go to some of the assets that do exist. Because here's some good news. So Mike, I'm gonna take and expound upon your the premise of your question. I'll give you some good news and I'll give you some bad news. The good news is, believe it or not, there is a program or programs for every part of your sales cycle. By way of your
Okay.
example, those
Okay.
10 companies, they may be in different parts of the sales cycle in 10 different places around the world. And there is a program to help assist them.
Okay.
There's a program to help get them an agent or distributor in a particular country. There's a program that will help prospect. If you're having trouble getting to that country, the US Embassy can help find potential prospects for you. There is a program, and this is what I used to run that you indicated, called the Advocacy Center, where if you're in front of a public international contract overseas, the US government will elevate your pursuit into the United States national interest. And basically, you become an extension of US foreign policy overseas. The ambassador and other US government interlocutors can advocate on your behalf and say your widget made in St. Paul is in the United States national interest, Mr. Minister, for your decisions. There's the Export-Import Bank financing, there's grant writings, and on and on and on. This is all the good news. The bad news is these programs are spread among 15 different agencies, and never the twain shall meet. As you're aware, we do not have a Department of Trade and Investment. And so some of these assets reside in the Commerce Department.
Yep.
Some reside in the State Department. Obviously, Export-Import Bank's its own agency, on and on and on. If you are one of those widget makers where an ag company, there's a Foreign and Agricultural Service. So the good news is in Minneapolis, there is a United States Export Assistance Center run by a fellow good friend of mine named Ryan Connie. The idea behind that is you go to Ryan's office in Minneapolis, and he is a one-stop shop to introduce you to all of these assets. So you don't even have to go to Washington. You don't have to know Washington. You can darken Ryan's door, and he's going to be a conduit and help you navigate all those disparate US government assets. The last thing I'll say about this, the good news part of it, is these assets are actually really good. And I ended up having to sit on top of these assets by an executive order. And I learned that they've all stood the test of time. They're at least a generation, if not older. They've gone through the crucible of international business. And finally, we have some disadvantages that I mentioned at the top of our discussion as a country, but we have some real heavy advantages. One is just who we are. And if you can imagine overseas, if an ambassador or an assistant secretary of state is articulating support on your company's behalf, Mike, in certain countries, really, those countries rely heavily on the United States for myriad reasons. Maybe it's defense, maybe it's U.S. foreign aid, maybe it's just a close ally, and we have an advantage there over even some of our own allies, just given who we are. So it's one of those things where I'll date myself here a little bit. That old E.F. Hutton ad, right? When E.F. Hutton speaks, if the U.S. government's speaking and saying this is an ask, that country is going to pay attention, and that is a heavy advantage that we have that I think all U.S. exporters should take advantage of.
Well, this has been very informative, Bryan. I'm sure there's a lot of our smaller manufacturers, even some of the larger ones, in a variety of industries that don't realize all these programs and assets are available to them. If I could ask one final question, what is the consequence then of us not taking this on? I guess if we don't do anything based on what you just described.
Yeah.
What does it look like for our electronics industry in North America, or in the United States, I should say, 5 years from now?
Then you are fighting with one hand tied behind your back. And you know this better than I do in your industry, how tough it is already, and how unlevel the playing field is. Why fight with one arm tied behind your back?
Very true.
Your competitors, your international competitors, I can assure you, are using home government support however and whenever they can, whether it's concessionary financing, or it's home government advocacy. I mean,
Okay.
one thought exercise I can give you, Mike, is if and anyone listening to this, if you just close your eyes and imagine a word association. If I said Prince William and Kate Middleton, Rolls Royce, what does one think of? Usually, not to lead the jury, but usually you think of, the royal couple in the back of a Rolls Royce waving at a parade or something like that. You can Google that, search that, and what you'll see in a picture is you will see along those pictures of in a car waving, you will see Prince William and Kate Middleton at a Rolls Royce engine factory. The English use the royals to advocate on their behalf, especially in their old dominions. That is we don't have a royal family, right? We don't have anything like that. So you're fighting with one arm tied behind your back. Last point you made, I didn't elaborate enough on, is these assets are available to companies of all sizes. There is no minimum for the Export-Import Bank. There is no minimum for advocacy. There is no minimum for a partner search or prospecting. As a matter of fact, in my time, and I'm sure now, we went out of our way to look for SMEs to be of assistance to, because we had all the big guys we can handle. We were worried more about SMEs. So if you are a small company or even a supplier, you're going to have a willing hand reaching out to you to help you however they can.
Very good. Well, Bryan, this has been very informative, and it sounds like you've outlined some great programs for all of our companies involved in manufacturing to expand their business and move to the global stage in a profitable fashion. So these programs exist. It's just a matter, like you said, speaking up, so we're not fighting with one hand behind our back. Again,
That's
Bryan, for you and all our viewers today, I want to thank you for your time. This is Michael Carano with the IPC Thought Leadership Program.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.